What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is this Husqvarna lawnmower, and the problem is that the engine has a terrible vibration. It's also having some running issues. After mowing for a while, the engine will abruptly stop, and then when trying to restart it, it's tough to pull the rope. Let's take a good look at it and find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this mower. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. So I do have some information on what happened to this mower, and the story's kind of sad. The owner of this mower likes to mow first and then edge with the trimmer. That means they get kind of aggressive with the mowing so they don't have to use the trimmer as much. They got a little too close to a basketball goal and ended up hitting the stud for the post, damaging the blade and bending the crankshaft. They ended up calling me and asking for my advice, and I told them they should just buy another mower. However, they did not like that idea, stating that it was only 2 seasons old. I then told them that if you're unwilling to buy a new mower, then you might as well just keep using it until it stops. And that's exactly what they did. However, they didn't check the oil like they should have been. I asked them how they were checking the oil, and they said they would remove the dipstick to inspect the oil's condition, adding some when needed and stating that it was never low. What they should have done was clean the oil off the dipstick and then press the dipstick against the filler neck without screwing it in and then seeing if it's low. If they had done that, they would have realized that the engine oil was low and the upper bearings started to get severely damaged. That means not only do we need to replace the bent crankshaft, but also the block. Unfortunately, you cannot buy a brand new block anymore, and that means we need to either buy a brand new engine for over $250 or find a used engine for a lot less. The choice was then made to replace the engine with a used one that I was able to find for $40. It's not exactly the same engine, so we'll need to make a few modifications to get it to work. The first thing we need to do is drain all the fluids from the engine so we don't make a huge mess. Now, after draining the engine oil, you can see there wasn't much inside the block. I don't blame the owner for not knowing how to use the dipstick, and the reason is that most people seem to have the same issue. That's okay, this sort of problem still allows the engine to last for a few seasons before you need to replace it. However, I hope they learn from their mistake after I replace this one. Once the fluids are out, we can now safely turn the mower on inside so we can take the blade and blade adapter off, which also has the drive pulley built into it. The problem is that the adapter is stuck to the shaft. That means we'll need to use a puller to take it off. Now you can find these online or at your local auto parts store. To use it, you'll need to put the bolt back on the shaft with just a few turns so the puller has something to brace against. I also moved the belt off the pulley so I don't damage it. I then put the jaws behind the pulley and then turn the bolt on the puller till it makes contact with the bolt on the blade, and then keep turning it till the adapter hits the bolt. You may have to do this a couple of times, and in my case I had to use a longer bolt so I could get the adapter off the shaft. Now you can see it was just some rust buildup that was keeping the adapter stuck to it. The next thing to do is to remove the 3 bolts that hold the engine to the deck, and then after that we can take it off the deck. So here's the old engine, and even though it's severely damaged, it looks really good when compared to the one we're going to replace it with. So this is the replacement. If you couldn't tell, it's got some paint on it. Now just because it's covered in overspray doesn't mean it's bad, it just doesn't look as nice. I do intend on swapping over the recoil and fuel tank so it doesn't look quite so bad. However, I won't be able to swap over the air filter base as they're not the same. One strange thing that I noticed was that the bolts for the old engine are those triangular bolts that are meant to cut new threads. I don't like reusing these to make new threads because if they break, they're quite difficult to get out. The bolts for the other engine are metric hex bolts, so unfortunately, there's no chance in swapping bolts. I took this replacement engine off a Black Max mower years ago. It had serious self-propel issues along with other issues, and I felt that scrapping it was the best thing for it and saving the engine. I was planning on using this engine for my own personal mower, but I guess I'll have to wait for another one. It looks like this mounting hole in the deck just broke off, and that means we'll need to weld it back into place. I did look at the other holes, and even though there's signs of cracking, they weren't as bad as this one. And even though the original engine only had 3 mounting bolts, Honda engines actually have 4 mounts available. You can see the mark the spare hole made in the paint on the deck. Now since I want this engine to be well supported, I'm going to drill the 4th hole in the deck. Now this is quite optional, but I think it should have been this way from the factory. After making a starter hole, I'll then use my step drill to get the hole size I want. Once the new hole has been drilled, I can now install the used engine on the deck and then install some of the bolts into the engine. It's very important that you try and start all the bolts by hand first, otherwise you might cross-thread them. Just remember to take your time, otherwise you could turn this into a different type of repair. I'm also not going to tighten any of the bolts until all of them are in place. That way the engine can still move around if we need the clearance to start the bolts. So it's time to install the blade adapter, but we have a slight problem. This is the original adapter that was on here when the blade hit the bolt, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but it is slightly bent. This, along with the bent crankshaft, was causing the mower to shake violently. That means we need to replace it with a brand new one. Luckily, these are still readily available and very affordable at only $15. If you'd like to know more about this particular adapter, there will be a link in the description. I'm going to use some lithium grease on the shaft to keep it from getting stuck in the future. For those who have done this type of repair, I'm not sure if that's what you would use, but I think it's better than using nothing. Now once the adapter is on, I'll work the belt back on the pulley and then finally install the blade. And even though the blade was replaced last year, the owner requested to have a new blade installed anyway. Unfortunately, this is when we find another problem. It turns out that the original bolt is too short to work with this style of adapter. That means we'll need to head to the parts store to get a longer bolt. And yet again, I thought this bolt would be a metric size, but it turns out to be a standard size instead. You can see the original blade adapter for this engine is extremely short, but the one meant for this deck is at least 3 times longer. When you do get a replacement bolt, make sure it's of a decent quality, because if it breaks, the blade might damage more than just the deck. This one didn't cost that much. I think it was a little over $3. The last thing we need to do is remove the oversprayed parts and swap over the newer parts. This is optional, but since it doesn't take any time to do, it's not a real bother. While we're here, we'll also install the brake cable and a new choke cable as well. Now the broken engine had an automatic choke system with a thermostat that controlled when to work the choke. However, on this engine, it requires a lever to activate the choke and throttle. Now I don't want to make things too complicated for the owner, so I'm going to set the idle speed to be the running speed. That way the new lever will only be a choke lever. I didn't have a new choke cable or lever, but I did have a speed selector cable and lever from a different Honda project. I decided to keep costs as low as possible, so I repurposed them for the choke system. I did let the owner know what I was doing, and they didn't have a problem with it. After installing it, I had to make sure to adjust the anchor so the choke flap completely closes, otherwise it'll be tough to start. While taking off the fuel line from the nicer tank, I accidentally pulled out the filter that's placed in the outlet pipe. That means adding an aftermarket filter isn't needed as there's already one installed. Also, don't forget to install these special sleeves that were in the oversprayed cover. Without them, the cover will make contact with the flywheel, and if you start the engine that way, you'll destroy the cover. Another reason why the original engine would be shaking is if the blade was bent or broken. Now since the engine uses the blade as a counterweight, with it damaged it would make the engine's rotating assembly off balance. It would be the same as adding or taking weights off your car. The wheel would then be unbalanced and then start to shake at certain speeds. The last thing we need to address is the other reason why this engine got destroyed sooner than normal, and that's the oil. Make sure you check your oil before you start your mower and make sure it's full. As mentioned earlier, press the dipstick against the threads and do not screw it in to accurately check the oil level. The last thing to do is reconnect the fuel line to the tank, add a splash of gasoline, then we can try starting the engine for the first time in a long time. So the engine sounds really good, although the idle speed still needs to be slightly increased. Otherwise, I'd say this engine swap went very well considering some of the obstacles we had to overcome. One of the things I like to do is stop the engine by turning the fuel valve to the off position. Unfortunately, after speaking with the owners, they never really bother with it like most people. I do think it's a great way to keep your carb from being destroyed on the off chance you do forget to empty your gas tank for long storage, especially if you use ethanol gasoline. In the end, the repair took about 4 hours to do, including filming, and the parts total was only $100. Aside from its yearly maintenance, hopefully we won't have to work on this mower anytime soon. So my question is, if your crankshaft was bent after hitting something and it was shaking quite badly, would you keep using it or would you do something about it, say replace the engine or go buy a new mower instead? Personally, I don't have a problem using it till it breaks, but it would be quite annoying to have the whole mower shaking while you were using it. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.